A powerful billionaire is on a mission to redevelop a neighborhood, but there's one family that refuses to leave. When Richard Sterling issued an ultimatum to the Carters, he thought it was just another eviction, but he didn't know the deep, buried secret that tied their families together. As the pressure mounts, the community fights back, and Richard's world is about to shatter. What he discovers will change everything. Will he choose justice over power, or will he risk it all for redemption? Stay tuned to see how this battle for a home turns into a fight for a legacy. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. Richard Sterling is a billionaire real estate mogul, celebrated for his business acumen, but infamous for his ruthless eviction policies that prioritize profits over people. His sharp suits, cold demeanor, and relentless drive have made him both a feared and respected figure in the industry. Richard's latest project involves acquiring properties in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, transforming it into a high-end commercial district that promises massive returns for his investors. In the heart of this neighborhood stands the historic Carter family home. The Carters are a multi-generational black family, deeply rooted in the community for over 6 decades. The matriarch, Sarah Carter, is a retired schoolteacher who has dedicated her life to her family and neighborhood. Her home is more than a house. It's a symbol of perseverance through decades of social and economic change. Sarah's strength and connection to the community are evident in her relationships with neighbors and her determination to protect what she has built. Richard and Sarah's worlds collide when Sterling's acquisition efforts reach the Carter family. While Richard sees the property as just another deal, Sarah views it as a cornerstone of her family's legacy. Richard's detached, pragmatic approach contrasts starkly with Sarah's deeply emotional connection to the home and her community. This clash of values sets the stage for an escalating conflict. The neighborhood itself is a character in its own right, filled with small businesses, vibrant murals, and a sense of history that residents fight to preserve. As Richard's plans for redevelopment threaten to erase these aspects, the tension builds. With the Carters standing firm against eviction, the stage is set for a dramatic and emotional journey that will test both Sarah's resilience and Richard's conscience. Richard had big plans for the neighborhood. His real estate empire was rapidly expanding, and the redevelopment of this particular area was the final piece of his grand vision. The properties he had acquired were being transformed one by one into luxury condos and commercial spaces that would bring in millions. However, there was one property that remained stubbornly untouched: the Carter family home. The Carters were the last family standing in the way of Richard's development project, and despite his best efforts, they refused to budge. Sarah Carter, the matriarch of the family, had spent her entire life in this home. It was more than just a house. It was a symbol of survival, of overcoming hardships, and of generations that had poured love and effort into maintaining the home that her ancestors had built. She was determined not to sell, not to leave. Every offer from Richard was rejected, and the pressure from his team mounted. The longer the Carters stayed, the more it threatened to delay Richard's entire plan, putting his project behind schedule and risking the wrath of his investors. Richard, always calm and calculated, found himself growing increasingly frustrated. He had built his empire on efficiency, on the ability to make things happen, and the Carters' refusal to comply felt like an obstacle he couldn't overcome. The more he pushed, the more they resisted. He had dealt with plenty of difficult negotiations in his time, but this one felt personal. The deeper Sarah dug in, the more Richard felt his patience wearing thin. Meanwhile, Ellen, Richard's trusted assistant, had begun to feel uneasy about the way things were unfolding. She had always respected Richard's business acumen, but the Carter story of a family holding on to their home for dear life started to stir something inside her. She began to question the ethics behind Richard's approach. She'd seen eviction notices served before, but this was different. The pressure tactics he was using on the Carters seemed cruel, especially as she saw Sarah's family standing firm, refusing to be intimidated or bought off. Richard, however, was not one to retreat. He had his investors to answer to, and they were growing impatient. The delays caused by the Carters' refusal to leave were beginning to affect the project's timeline. The pressure was building, and Richard knew he had to make a decision. His ultimatum was clear. The Carters had 30 days to vacate the property. If they refused, he would escalate the situation. No more offers, no more negotiations. The battle lines were drawn, and neither side was willing to back down. As the deadline approached, the Carters found themselves not only fighting for their home, but for the very soul of their community. Sarah, fueled by her deep connection to the neighborhood, rallied her neighbors and local activists. Flyers went up on every telephone pole, and community meetings were held in local churches. The story of the Carters' resistance spread, gaining traction with people who had once been passive observers of the gentrification happening around them. Soon, the Carters' plight became a symbol of something larger, a fight for justice against corporate greed. Local media outlets picked up the story, and a movement began to form, one that transcended the Carters' personal struggle. The more the community united behind them, the stronger Sarah's resolve grew. Richard, however, was not accustomed to being challenged in such a way. His approach had always been straightforward. Force the issue with legal action, apply enough pressure to make anyone fold. But the media storm surrounding the Carters and their supporters only seemed to inflame the situation. The more Sarah stood her ground, the more determined the community became to support her. The protests grew larger. Signs and chants demanding justice for the Carters rang through the streets, and local businesses closed in solidarity. Richard's legal team responded with a barrage of letters, threatening lawsuits and fines against anyone who interfered with the eviction process. It was a tactic that had worked before, but this time, the resistance seemed impenetrable. In the midst of the rising tension, Sarah found herself torn. She had always prided herself on her strength, her ability to keep her family together and protect them from the world. But now, that world was closing in on her, and the weight of it was starting to take its toll. Every day, she faced pressure not only from Richard and his team, but from the growing unrest within her own family. Her son, who had always been her rock, now questioned the value of fighting when the odds seemed so stacked against them. Sarah's heart ached as she watched her children struggle with the stress, torn between their loyalty to her and their desire for peace. Yet, Sarah knew that leaving wasn't an option. This fight wasn't just about a house. It was about preserving the legacy her family had worked so hard to build. Every night, she stayed up late, working alongside the community, planning strategies, writing letters of support, and coordinating with activists. Her strength never wavered in public, but privately, the pressure of leading a fight that seemed impossible weighed heavily on her. Richard, on the other hand, found himself facing a different kind of pressure. The media coverage of the Carters' stand against him was becoming increasingly hostile. Reporters questioned his ethics, calling him a villain who cared more about money than people. Social media erupted in criticism, with hashtags like #SaveTheCarters trending across platforms. Richard's image, carefully cultivated over years, was crumbling. Despite the pressure, he refused to back down. He'd faced criticism before, and it had never swayed him. To him, this was business. The project needed to move forward, and the Carters were nothing more than a roadblock. The more the media scrutinized him, the harder his resolve became. He couldn't afford to lose. The stakes were too high. As Sarah's struggle deepened and Richard's resolve grew harder, the battle for the Carter home was far from over. Both sides dug in, unwilling to back down, and the lines between personal conviction and business became ever more blurred. The night before the scheduled eviction, Richard sat alone in his office, going over final preparations. The next day, his team was set to arrive at the Carter property, ready to begin the removal process. He had no doubts about the outcome. Everything had been planned meticulously, and the Carters would be gone by morning. But as he sifted through paperwork, his hand brushed against an envelope, one that had been slipped under the door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the address wasn't from any law firm or business associate. Curious, he tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its edges slightly worn as if it had been kept hidden for years. The letter was brief, but the words sent a chill down Richard's spine. The writer mentioned the Carters in a way that he hadn't expected, hinting at a connection between Sarah Carter's family and his own. The letter alluded to a past that Richard had long buried, a secret that could change everything. The words were cryptic, but they suggested that there was more to the Carter family than he had ever known. His hands trembled as he reread the letter, trying to piece together what it meant. Was this a threat? A desperate attempt to make him back down? Or was it something deeper, something that could force him to reconsider everything he had planned? As the unsettling thoughts lingered in his mind, Richard's phone buzzed. It was a message from his assistant, Ellen. She had just received an anonymous tip. Sarah had learned of Richard's plans to demolish the house immediately after the eviction. Richard had always known that the Carters would fight to the bitter end, but this revelation sparked something in Sarah that he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about leaving anymore. Now, it was about saving her family's history from being erased completely. The urgency of the situation skyrocketed as Sarah, more determined than ever, gathered her supporters for one final stand. Richard, meanwhile, found himself grappling with a growing sense of doubt. The letter, coupled with the new information about Sarah's resolve, made him question his next steps. For the first time, he wasn't entirely sure about the path he had chosen. His focus had always been on the bottom line, but now there was a deeper, more personal struggle at play. Was he really doing the right thing? As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Richard made a decision. He couldn't let the night pass without confronting Sarah directly. The stakes were too high, and he needed to see for himself what kind of person he was up against. Stepping out of his office, he grabbed his coat, determined to go to the Carter house, unannounced. He would meet Sarah face to face, away from the cameras, away from the crowds. It was time to have the final conversation, one that would determine the future of the Carter family home. With his heart pounding and a sense of unease settling in, Richard left his mansion and drove through the quiet streets toward the Carter property. He didn't know what he would say, but he knew it was a meeting that couldn't wait. As he approached the house, the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. The tension was palpable, and every step toward the door felt heavier than the last. This confrontation, he realized, could change everything. Richard rang the doorbell, his mind racing. Would Sarah stand her ground, or would this be the turning point, the moment where everything shifted? The door creaked open, and Sarah stood in front of him, her eyes steady, her expression unwavering. She hadn't been expecting him, but the moment was here. The suspense hung thick in the air as Richard took a deep breath and stepped forward. The fate of the Carter home, and possibly more, now lay in the balance. Richard stood in front of Sarah, the tension between them palpable. His mind raced, but he kept his composure. Sarah's unwavering gaze cut through him, the weight of years of history in her eyes. "You don't care about the people," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "You never have. This isn't just about a house for you. It's about erasing us, our community, everything we've built. And for what? A few more luxury condos?" Richard opened his mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. He had always prided himself on being a pragmatic businessman, a master of the deal. But standing there, facing Sarah and hearing her words, he began to feel the enormity of the human cost of his decisions. He had always seen the Carters as just another obstacle, another hurdle to overcome for the sake of his business. But now it felt different. This wasn't just a business transaction anymore. It was a battle with real consequences. As they spoke, the sound of chanting grew louder from the street outside. Richard stepped back from the door and looked out the window. A group of protesters had gathered in front of the Carter home, waving signs that read "Save the Carters" and "Stop the Eviction." The community, once passive, had mobilized in full force. Neighbors, local activists, and even some former tenants had joined in the protest, all united in their opposition to Richard's plans. The peaceful demonstration, while effective in rallying support, was starting to complicate Richard's carefully laid plans. The media had already arrived, cameras flashing as they captured the growing movement. The protests, while peaceful, attracted more media attention than Richard anticipated. His lawyers had warned him of the potential PR disaster, but he had underestimated the power of the community's resistance. The longer the protests continued, the more his reputation suffered. News outlets ran stories questioning his motives, his business practices, and his disregard for the people who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. The pressure was mounting, and Richard could feel the walls closing in. Sarah's lawyer, a seasoned attorney who had represented the family for years, had uncovered troubling inconsistencies in Richard's acquisition of the Carter property. There were discrepancies in the paperwork, irregularities in the transfer of ownership, and even questions about whether the eviction process had followed proper legal procedures. Sarah's lawyer presented these findings in a public letter, demanding that Richard's team provide answers. The legal challenges began to pile up, and Richard found himself facing not only a public relations nightmare, but also a potential lawsuit that could delay or even derail his entire project. As Richard sat in his office, reviewing the latest legal documents and media reports, his phone buzzed. It was a call from his lead investor, one of the most influential figures in his network. Richard, the voice on the other end, said, "We need this resolved, and we need it resolved quickly. The delays are becoming unacceptable. If you don't get rid of the Carters soon, we'll need to reconsider our backing of the project." The weight of the conversation hit Richard hard. The investors, whose support had been the cornerstone of his empire, were losing patience. The pressure to move forward, to resolve the situation one way or another, was intensifying. But with the legal battles mounting, the protests growing louder, and Sarah's steadfast resistance, the path ahead was no longer clear. Richard's mind raced as he tried to weigh his options. The pressure to act quickly was suffocating. But the more he tried to push forward, the more obstacles seemed to appear. His vision for the future of the neighborhood was slipping further and further out of reach, and the personal toll of the situation began to take its toll. Ellen had always seen herself as Richard's loyal assistant, the calm and rational voice behind his success. She had been with him through countless business deals, navigating difficult situations with professionalism and efficiency. But as the conflict over the Carters escalated, Ellen found herself drawn deeper into the story she had initially only observed from the sidelines. She had been tasked with documenting the eviction process for internal purposes, but as she spent more time with Sarah and her family, something began to shift inside her. Ellen began to visit the Carter home under the pretext of gathering information. But soon, she found herself genuinely listening to Sarah's stories. She learned about the history of the house, about the community that had supported the Carters through thick and thin, and about the deep-rooted connection Sarah had to the neighborhood. What started as a professional assignment became personal. Ellen was particularly moved by the sight of the elderly members of the Carter family, whose lives were intimately tied to the house Richard planned to demolish. She started to see Richard's project through a different lens, one where the human cost was no longer invisible. Her growing empathy for the Carters led to a crisis of loyalty. Ellen found herself torn between her longtime employer, the man she had trusted and respected, and the family whose history was now being erased by his ambition. She couldn't reconcile the man she had known with the actions he was taking against the Carters. The more she learned, the harder it became to turn a blind eye. Her internal conflict grew, but she didn't know how to act on it without jeopardizing her career and possibly her future in Richard's world. Meanwhile, the pressure on Sarah's family intensified from within as well. Sarah's teenage grandson, Marcus, had grown up hearing the stories of their family's resilience, of how they had fought for what was right. But as the days wore on and the protests continued, Marcus started to question whether peaceful resistance was enough. He had watched his grandmother bear the weight of this fight with incredible strength, but his own frustration began to grow. Marcus had always been an idealist, but now, standing on the front lines of the protests, he felt that the stakes were too high for diplomacy. He began to push for more drastic action, even suggesting that they take matters into their own hands. Sarah was torn. On one hand, she understood Marcus's anger. She had felt it herself at his age. But on the other hand, she knew that taking a more aggressive approach could alienate their supporters and risk everything they had worked for. The tension between them grew as Sarah struggled to maintain unity within her family, while Marcus's restlessness threatened to fracture the peace they had built. His willingness to act outside the law made Sarah uneasy, but she couldn't help but wonder whether he was right, whether the fight for their home would require more than just marches and petitions. As tensions within the Carter family reached a boiling point, Richard found himself haunted by his own past. Late at night, when the weight of his decisions grew unbearable, he would sit in his study, reflecting on how he had come to this point. Flashbacks from his childhood began to surface, moments that he had long buried in the recesses of his mind. He remembered growing up in a modest home, where his parents had struggled to make ends meet. His father, an ambitious man in his own right, had always dreamed of a life beyond their humble beginnings. But it was Richard who had taken those dreams and turned them into an empire. But those memories weren't as simple as success stories. Richard had watched his father struggle, watched him fail, and that failure had left scars. He had learned early on that the world was a place where only the strong survived. His rise to power had been built on ruthlessness and sacrifices that had cost him relationships, trust, and any semblance of a moral compass. As he looked at the Carter property, the weight of his past decisions gnawed at him. Was he really doing the right thing? Was all this worth it? Just as Richard wrestled with these emotions, a local journalist uncovered a series of documents linking Richard's family to the neighborhood's history. The journalist had been investigating the story from multiple angles, and the deeper she dug, the more she discovered. Richard's ancestors had once owned a portion of the land where the Carters now lived, but the history had been erased over time. This revelation, coupled with the ongoing protests and legal challenges, sent shockwaves through the community. The journalist's findings intensified public scrutiny of Richard's actions. The press began to question whether Richard's plans for the neighborhood were just another example of gentrification, erasing the past in the name of progress. Articles began to surface with headlines like "The Billionaire Who Wants to Wipe Out History" and "What Richard Sterling Doesn't Want You to Know." Richard's past, and his family's connection to the very land he was now trying to redevelop, was suddenly in the spotlight. The weight of public opinion grew heavier, and Richard realized that, for the first time, he might not be able to control the narrative. His carefully constructed image was starting to crack, and the world was beginning to see him in a new light. Richard's frustration reached a boiling point. After weeks of legal battles, mounting public pressure, and internal doubts, he decided to take a different approach to deal with Sarah. In a last-ditch attempt to resolve the situation without further conflict, he invited Sarah to a private meeting at his office. His plan was simple: offer her a financial incentive to leave the house quietly, in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement. He knew Sarah's resilience was unyielding, but he believed that her financial struggles might sway her decision. The offer was generous, enough to secure her family's future and give her a fresh start. Richard was confident that she would accept, reasoning that no one could resist such an opportunity. But Sarah's reaction shattered his expectations. She listened to his proposal in silence, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but filled with an unshakable resolve. "Money can't buy everything, Richard," she said, her eyes locked on his. "It can't buy our history, our legacy, or the future of our community. I won't sell out my family, and I won't let you erase us." Richard felt his temper flare, but he held it in check. He had expected resistance, but this was different. Her refusal cut deeper than any legal challenge or protest. Sarah's response wasn't just a rejection of his offer. It was a personal affront to everything he had built. He had underestimated her, and now his resentment festered. How dare she dismiss his generous offer as if it meant nothing? To Richard, it felt like a betrayal, a challenge to his authority, his way of doing business. Meanwhile, tensions within Sarah's family began to reach a breaking point. Marcus, the young, idealistic grandson who had grown impatient with the slow pace of peaceful resistance, decided to take matters into his own hands. During a protest, he pushed his way through the police barricades, attempting to block a bulldozer from entering the property. His actions led to a confrontation with law enforcement, and before anyone could stop it, Marcus was arrested. The arrest was a devastating blow to the Carter family. Sarah's worst fears were realized as she watched her grandson being taken away in handcuffs. The sight of Marcus, her own flesh and blood, caught in the crossfire of this fight, struck at the very heart of her resolve. She had always been the one to hold the family together, to shield them from the world's harshest realities. But now, she felt the weight of their shared struggle more than ever. The rift in the family was immediate. Sarah's daughter, who had always supported her mother's cause, began to question the wisdom of their methods. "We've lost control, Mom," she said, her voice shaking with worry. "Marcus isn't the person we raised. He's angry, and he's willing to fight dirty. I don't know if we can keep going like this." Sarah tried to calm her daughter, but the pain of Marcus's arrest and the widening divide within her own family made her question if their peaceful resistance was truly enough. In the midst of this turmoil, Ellen, whose loyalty to Richard had been slipping for weeks, made a bold move that could change the course of the battle. Having grown close to Sarah and her family, Ellen had been quietly documenting the evictions, the protests, and the behind-the-scenes strategies Richard had been employing. One night, after receiving a tip from a local activist, Ellen decided she could no longer remain silent. She leaked critical information about Richard's tactics to the press, exposing his methods of intimidation, bribery, and the questionable legality of his dealings. The leak caused an immediate firestorm. The public was outraged at the revelations, and the media seized upon the story, painting Richard as a villain who was willing to use underhanded tactics to force the Carters out of their home. The press covered the leak extensively, with reporters digging deeper into Richard's past dealings and questioning the ethics of his business empire. Ellen, fully aware of the consequences, prepared herself for the fallout. She had risked her job and her career, but the Carters' cause was now amplified beyond their local community. The leak gave them a new sense of momentum, and public opinion began to swing in their favor. But just as Richard was dealing with the fallout from the media storm, he received a phone call that only deepened his confusion. The mysterious letter he had received earlier, the one that had hinted at a connection between the Carters and his own family, had been sent by someone he thought was long gone, someone from his father's past. The letter revealed cryptic details about a long-forgotten affair, an old family secret that Richard's father had kept hidden. The revelation rattled Richard to his core. He began to piece together fragments of his childhood, moments that had never fully made sense to him. Was this secret tied to the Carters? Had his family been connected to theirs in ways he never knew? As the questions swirled in his mind, Richard's confidence faltered. The past he had worked so hard to bury was now threatening to resurface, and the implications of the letter's contents could change everything he thought he knew about himself and about the fight with the Carters. The stakes were higher than ever, and Richard's carefully constructed world seemed to be unraveling. The situation took a sudden turn when, just as Richard believed he had the upper hand, a judge intervened. After hearing new evidence presented by Sarah's lawyer, the judge issued a temporary injunction that halted the eviction proceedings. The evidence was a bombshell. Documents showing that Richard's acquisition of the property had been marred by questionable practices, including forged signatures and possible illegal actions in securing ownership. The legal maneuver threw a wrench into Richard's plans, buying the Carters more time, and it only added to the mounting pressure on him. For Richard, the delay was more than just a legal setback. It was a personal affront. He had worked too hard to let this fight slip away, and now the legal system was playing against him. With his investors breathing down his neck, the mounting media scrutiny, and now a temporary halt to the eviction, Richard was beginning to lose control of the situation. His anger flared, and he immediately called Ellen into his office. When Ellen walked in, Richard wasted no time. "What the hell happened, Ellen? I trusted you. I thought you were on my side," he growled, the sharp edge of his voice reflecting his fury. Ellen stood her ground, looking him square in the eye. "I was on your side until I realized that what you were doing wasn't right," she replied, her voice steady but full of conviction. The argument between them was intense, with Richard demanding to know why Ellen had betrayed him, while Ellen challenged Richard's moral compass. "You've built this empire, Richard, but at what cost?" she asked. "The Carters aren't just a business transaction to them. They're a family. You're tearing their world apart for the sake of your bottom line. How could you not see that?" Richard's face turned red with anger. "It's business, Ellen. You wouldn't understand. It's just business," he shot back, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Ellen wasn't done. "It's more than business now. This is about people's lives. The Carters aren't just pawns in your game. Maybe it's time you looked in the mirror and asked yourself why you're really doing this." Ellen's words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He had spent years convincing himself that his actions were justified, that the ends always justified the means. But now, standing in front of him, Ellen was forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth. His motivations might not be as pure as he had always believed. The moral clarity he had relied on for so long was beginning to crumble. As Ellen walked out of the office, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts, the door to the past creaked open even further. That evening, Sarah invited Richard to meet her at the Carter house. With the temporary injunction in place, she was no longer afraid to face him. Sarah had something important to show him. When Richard arrived, Sarah greeted him with a solemn look. She led him into the family room, where a small wooden box sat on the table. It was old, weathered with age, but the elegance of the craftsmanship remained clear. She opened it slowly, revealing a family heirloom, a delicate, ornate key attached to a faded leather tag. The key was beautiful, intricately carved, but its significance was more than just its appearance. "This was my father's key," Sarah said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "It's been passed down through generations, and it's tied to something more important than just our home. It's tied to your father." Richard's breath caught in his throat. The revelation hit him like a wave. What did this key have to do with his father? Sarah continued, explaining that her grandfather had told stories about a time when Richard's father had helped the Carters when they were struggling. "Your father was involved in the history of this house, Richard. His name is tied to it," she said, her eyes never leaving his. Richard's mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. He had always believed his family's wealth and legacy were built solely through his own efforts, but now he was being forced to confront the reality that his father's past might hold secrets he was unwilling to acknowledge. The heirloom, the key, it was a connection to something far deeper than he had ever realized. But the real shock came when Sarah handed him an old deed. Richard's hands trembled as he read the words on the yellowing paper. His father's name was on it, listed as a co-owner of the very house Richard had planned to demolish. The deed, dated decades ago, confirmed what Sarah had said. His father had once been involved in the Carter family's history. The discovery was earth-shattering. Richard stared at the deed, his mind spinning as the weight of the truth settled over him. His father's actions, long buried in the past, were now inextricably linked to the Carters' home. The fight he had been waging wasn't just about property or business. It was about family, legacy, and the very foundation of his empire. Cliffhanger. As Richard's gaze lingered on the deed, the world around him seemed to fall away. His past, his family, his entire sense of identity was now in question. The revelations about his father's connection to the Carters had turned the entire conflict on its head, and Richard was left facing a truth that could shatter everything he had worked for. Richard's world turned upside down when he discovered that his father, the man who had built his empire, had once owned a Carter property. At first, it seemed impossible. The Carters had lived there for generations, and Richard had always assumed the house had simply changed hands over the years through ordinary transactions. But as he dug deeper, the truth began to unravel. Richard found a series of old documents tucked away in his father's study, hidden beneath a pile of financial papers. The documents included a land deed that proved his father had once been the rightful owner of the Carter property, years before he had ever acquired it. The timing of the sale was curious. Richard learned that his father had sold the property under mysterious circumstances, without much explanation, and at a price that seemed far below market value. The sale had taken place during a period of significant social and political upheaval, and at the time, Richard's father had been at the height of his career. The deal had been quick, final, and largely unnoticed in the eyes of the public. It seemed like a business transaction, but to Richard, it began to feel like something far more complicated. Determined to find out more, Richard dug further into his father's past, and what he uncovered sent shockwaves through him. Inside an old leather-bound diary, Richard found the answer to the questions that had been plaguing him. The diary, written by his father during the 1940s and 1950s, detailed the complex relationships he had formed during that time, including one with a man named Thomas Carter, Sarah's grandfather. The entries revealed a deep, personal friendship between the two men, who had shared a mutual respect for each other despite the racial and social barriers of the time. Richard's father had helped Thomas Carter in various ways, both professionally and personally, though the specifics were vague. But the entries hinted at a troubling truth. The Carter family had been wrongfully stripped of their ownership of the property during the segregation-era policies that targeted black families. Richard's father had been involved in those dealings, although the full extent of his involvement was unclear. What was clear was that Thomas Carter had trusted him, and in the end, the Carters had lost their home due to a system that had denied them fair treatment and rightful ownership. As Richard read the diary's pages, he felt a deep sense of guilt and betrayal. His father, the man he had always admired and whose legacy he had worked so hard to preserve, had been part of a system that had oppressed the very people he was now fighting to evict. Richard felt his moral compass spin, torn between his loyalty to his investors and his growing sense of responsibility to the Carters and their community. The more he learned, the more Richard struggled with the truth. How could he reconcile the man he thought he knew with the actions revealed in the diary? The fight over the Carter property was no longer just a business deal to him. It had become a battle for justice, one that was personal in ways he had never expected. The history of the Carters, intertwined with his own family's legacy, was now something Richard couldn't ignore. As he sat in his father's old study, the weight of the diary heavy in his hands, Richard felt trapped. His investors had made it clear that the eviction needed to happen quickly, and the pressure to deliver was mounting. But how could he continue with the eviction, knowing what he now knew? How could he tear down the house, the symbol of so much history and pain, when his own father's actions had set the stage for this moment? Richard was at a crossroads. His investors wanted results, quick, profitable results, but his conscience was beginning to scream at him. He had spent years convincing himself that his father's empire had been built through hard work and sound decisions. But now it felt like that empire was built on lies, manipulation, and exploitation. The pressure to keep moving forward was immense, but so was the weight of his growing moral obligation. The conflict inside him intensified as he realized that the fate of the Carters and the legacy of his own family was in his hands. Was he willing to risk everything to right the wrongs of the past? Or would he continue down the path of greed and business, ignoring the personal responsibility he now felt to the Carter family? The diary had opened a door that Richard couldn't close. The truth was out, and he could no longer ignore the consequences of his actions. The decision ahead was clear, yet impossible. He was caught between two worlds, his father's legacy and the legacy of the Carters, and the weight of that choice would change everything. Richard's world had been turned upside down, and as the full weight of his father's actions settled on his shoulders, he couldn't simply move forward with business as usual. The diary had exposed a side of his father he had never expected, and the implications of the findings were far-reaching. Richard knew he had to investigate further. The evidence of systemic injustice in his father's dealings with the Carter family was undeniable, and he felt a growing sense of responsibility to confront these wrongs head-on. The more Richard dug, the clearer it became that the Carter family's property had been seized through illegal and morally questionable means. He found archived court documents and historical records that confirmed the discriminatory practices that had been used to strip black families of their land during the era of segregation. His father, along with others in the business community at the time, had been complicit in these practices, ensuring that black families like the Carters were systematically dispossessed of their homes and their wealth. Feeling the full weight of this newfound knowledge, Richard knew he couldn't ignore it. But what could he do with the truth now? The question lingered in his mind as he reached out to Sarah. Richard arranged to meet her discreetly, away from the media and the prying eyes of his investors. This meeting was different. He wasn't there to discuss the eviction or offer ultimatums. He was there to listen. When they met in a small cafe, the tension was palpable. Sarah, who had fought so hard to protect her family's legacy, looked at Richard with a mixture of skepticism and cautious hope. Richard, on the other hand, felt conflicted. He couldn't change the past, but he could choose to confront it. "I've been investigating the history," Richard began, his voice heavy with emotion. "Your grandfather wasn't just stripped of his property. It was part of a larger, systematic effort to take what belonged to families like yours. I've seen the documents, the court rulings. My father, he was involved in it. He helped make it happen." Sarah listened carefully, her face unreadable. Richard's admission was a step forward, but it wasn't enough to undo the damage of decades. Still, Sarah's guarded expression softened slightly, and she nodded, as though acknowledging that the conversation they were having was a start. "I'm sorry," Richard said, his voice barely a whisper. "I never knew, but now I do, and I can't just turn away from it." Sarah didn't speak right away. She took a long pause before replying. "You've done more than anyone else ever has. But words won't bring back what was taken from us. Actions speak louder than apologies." Richard nodded, understanding the weight of her words. It wasn't enough to admit guilt. It was time for action. As Richard continued to grapple with the enormity of his findings, he received unexpected counsel from Ellen, his longtime assistant. Ellen had been conflicted for weeks, torn between loyalty to Richard and her growing discomfort with his methods. But now, seeing Richard's genuine remorse, she offered a bold idea. "We could use this," Ellen said one evening, after a particularly tense meeting with Richard. "We could come clean, go public with everything. Tell the world what your father did and how you're trying to make things right. It would be a gamble, but it could change everything. The Carters would have a chance to keep their home, and you could finally show the world that you're more than just a businessman. You could be a man of integrity." Richard was taken aback by Ellen's suggestion. It was risky, unprecedented, but there was a part of him that saw the potential for redemption in it. It wasn't just about undoing the eviction. It was about confronting the legacy of injustice head-on. "I'm not sure if that's possible," Richard said, uncertain. "The investors will never go for it, and the public won't believe that I'm doing this out of anything other than guilt." Ellen shook her head. "It's not about their approval. It's about what's right. And if you're truly committed to changing things, you'll find a way to make it happen. It's your move, Richard." As Richard sat with Ellen's words, something inside him shifted. The path ahead wasn't easy, but it was clear. He had to make things right. He wasn't just fighting to protect the Carters' home. He was fighting for his own redemption. Meanwhile, Marcus, Sarah's teenage grandson, had been closely watching Richard's transformation. Marcus, who had once been skeptical of any peaceful solution, saw the shift in Richard's actions and was inspired. He had been organizing protests, fighting for the Carters' right to stay. But now, Marcus saw an opportunity for something greater. With Richard's change of heart, Marcus began to shift his focus. He reached out to the community and started organizing not just for a cause, but for change. Positive change that could impact the entire neighborhood. This isn't just about one house, Marcus told his peers. It's about standing up for what's right, about fighting for justice in our community. We can change the system. Marcus's energy and passion spread throughout the neighborhood, and soon, the community was rallying behind Richard's newfound resolve. What had once been a struggle over a single piece of property now became a symbol for wider social change. The fight was no longer about evicting a family. It was about fighting the systemic injustices that had been allowed to persist for generations. Richard, Sarah, Ellen, and Marcus were no longer just individuals fighting for their own goals. They were part of a larger movement for justice, one that could change the course of their community's history. As Richard began to take steps to make amends and fight for the Carters' right to remain in their home, the pressure from his investors grew unbearable. They had made it clear. He either resolved the situation quickly by pushing forward with the development, or they would find someone else to handle the project. To them, it was nothing more than a business decision. The Carters were an obstacle, and obstacles had to be removed. Richard's hands were tied. The investors held the power, and without their support, his empire, the empire built on deals like this one, would crumble. Every conversation with them grew more threatening, with ultimatums flying fast. You either move forward, Richard, or you're out, one of his investors said in a cold, calculating voice. We can't afford this kind of uncertainty. You need to make it happen. Every day, Richard could feel his resolve weakening. He had promised Sarah and her family that he would fight for them, but his future was on the line. The stakes were higher than ever, and Richard began to question whether the truth, his growing conviction to make things right, could outweigh the cost to his career. Could he really stand against the powerful forces threatening to tear down the Carters' home? Meanwhile, Sarah remained distrustful of Richard. Despite his admission and his promises, the scars of the past ran deep. She had fought too long and too hard for her family's survival to believe that anyone, especially someone like Richard Sterling, could change overnight. Each time Richard tried to assure her of his sincerity, Sarah's doubts surfaced. You expect me to believe that after all this time, you've suddenly decided to fight for us? Sarah asked one night, her voice heavy with years of pain and skepticism. I've seen men like you before. You say one thing and then do another. I'm not fooled, Richard. Her words hit him harder than he expected, despite his best intentions. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was still seen as just another rich man with a hidden agenda. Richard tried to explain, but Sarah wasn't ready to hear it. Her anger was justified, and her mistrust was something he had to earn, not demand. As the days passed, the tension in the community began to mount. The Carters, supported by neighbors and activists, were preparing for a final stand. The looming eviction date was drawing closer, and the streets were filled with the voices of those who had gathered to protest. In every corner of the neighborhood, there was a palpable sense of urgency. Sarah, though torn, stood firm as a leader of the fight, rallying the community with speeches of defiance and unity. But even as she fought to protect the legacy of her family, the shadow of doubt hung over her. She was afraid that Richard's change of heart wasn't real, that it was just another tactic to manipulate the situation. For Richard, the battle was far from over. As the date of eviction loomed closer, he couldn't escape the weight of the decision ahead. The doubt, the guilt, and the pressure from his investors weighed heavily on him. Could he really risk everything for the Carters? In the midst of this chaos, Richard received an unexpected visit from one of his employees. The man, a quiet, reserved figure in his office, handed him a stack of documents. We've been looking into the Carters' claims, the man said, his voice hesitant, and we found something. As Richard sifted through the papers, his stomach sank. One of the documents was a deed, an old one, from the same period his father had owned the property. At first, Richard thought it was just another record of ownership, something to confirm the family's claim. But as he read more closely, something felt off. There were discrepancies in the signatures, dates that didn't match, and, most importantly, an official stamp that seemed to be forged. Richard's hands trembled as he stared at the document in disbelief. This new evidence threatened to unravel everything. If this document was indeed genuine, it could completely disprove the Carters' claim to the property, casting doubt on everything he had fought for. For a moment, Richard was paralyzed. The temptation to use the forged document to his advantage was strong. It could be the key to ending the battle and securing his investors' approval, allowing him to proceed with the development. But at what cost? Could he really betray everything he had just uncovered about his father's legacy? The weight of the choice hung heavily on his shoulders. If he chose to expose the forgery, he would risk everything: his integrity, his fight for the Carters, and the fragile trust he had just started to build with Sarah. On the other hand, if he ignored it, he could continue down the path of self-interest, securing his business and his empire. The decision was simple in theory, but impossible in practice. Richard stood in his office, staring at the forged document, unable to move. His mind raced, torn between his desire to protect his future and the knowledge that he could not ignore the truth. As the clock ticked, the tension in the air was palpable. Richard had to choose. The fate of the Carters and his own redemption depended on it. Richard stood at a crossroads, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The forged document lay on his desk, a symbol of temptation, but he knew that to remain true to the journey he had started with Sarah and the Carters, he couldn't take the easy way out. The truth had to come to light, no matter the consequences. After days of sleepless nights and agonizing over his options, Richard made the decision that would change everything. He would publicly reveal the diary, his father's personal account, the history of injustice, and the evidence that had been buried for decades. It wasn't just about saving the Carters' home anymore. It was about confronting the very foundation of his family's empire. With a sense of dread and determination, Richard made the necessary calls. He informed his investors that the development project was on hold. The battle he was about to wage wasn't just for one house. It was for everything that had been built on a system of exploitation and inequality. He knew this would put him at odds with the very people who had funded his empire, but he couldn't live with himself if he chose to turn a blind eye now. The decision to go public was a risk, one that could cost him everything. He could lose his career, his reputation, and the wealth he had spent a lifetime accumulating. But in that moment, Richard realized that there was something more valuable than all of those things. It was his integrity, his ability to look into the mirror and know that he had done what was right, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, Sarah, resolute in her commitment to fight for her family, had been preparing for the next phase of their battle. She had been gathering legal support, strategizing with her lawyer, and rallying the community for a final stand. But as the pressure mounted, she couldn't shake her fear that the fight was only getting harder. The public revelations about Richard's father had given Sarah and the Carters hope, but that hope was tempered by the reality of the legal system. They knew that the odds were stacked against them, and there was no guarantee of success. But Sarah was determined to hold her ground. Every day, the community had rallied around Sarah and her family. Neighbors, activists, and even strangers had come together to show their support. There were protests, rallies, and petitions that flooded the local government's offices. The pressure from the community was undeniable, and as the final court date loomed, Sarah prepared for the fight of her life. The weight of her family's legacy rested on her shoulders, but she no longer carried it alone. She had the backing of her neighbors, her community, and even some unexpected allies. People who had once remained silent, but were now standing with her in solidarity. Marcus, Sarah's grandson, had taken it upon himself to organize a massive rally. The streets were filled with people from all walks of life, united by the cause. His passion and drive were infectious, and soon the rally grew into something much larger than a protest. It became a movement for justice, for equality, and for the protection of the Carters' home. National media outlets began to take notice. The rally captured the attention of reporters and journalists from across the country, turning the Carters' story into a headline that would not be ignored. The once local battle for a family's home had now become a symbol of the fight against systemic racism and injustice. The entire nation was watching. As the rally reached its peak, Marcus spoke to the crowd, his voice amplified by the roar of thousands. "This isn't just about one house. It's about the future of our community," Marcus said, his words ringing with power and conviction. "This fight isn't just for the Carters. It's for everyone who has been pushed aside, overlooked, and silenced for too long. We will not back down." The rally sent shockwaves through the city, and soon, the fight for the Carters' home was no longer just a local issue. It was a national movement. The pressure on Richard mounted, and the stage was set for a dramatic showdown in the courtroom. As the day of the trial approached, both sides braced for what was sure to be a historic confrontation. Richard, having made his choice to stand with the truth, knew that this was the moment of reckoning. The Carters, armed with the community's unwavering support, prepared for a legal battle that could change the course of their future. Everything had led up to this moment. A courtroom showdown that would determine not just the fate of the Carters' home, but the moral compass of Richard Sterling. The air was thick with anticipation, and the stakes had never been higher. The courtroom was packed with anticipation as the trial reached its final hours. Sarah sat at the front, her heart racing with every word spoken. The air was thick with tension, and outside, the crowd of supporters continued to chant and cheer for justice. This was more than just a legal battle. It was a fight for the future of her family, her community, and the recognition of the injustices they had suffered for decades. Richard, standing at the witness stand, looked down at the papers in front of him. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision he had made. The path he had chosen wasn't an easy one. He had risked everything, his career, his wealth, and his standing in the business world, to stand by the truth. He had already faced his investors' wrath, and his reputation had been tarnished by the very people who had once supported him. But none of that mattered now. As he took a deep breath, Richard spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the room. "I know I've made mistakes in the past. I know I've done things that hurt people, that have benefited from a system that was built on inequality." He began, his words shaking the air with their honesty. "But the truth cannot be ignored. The Carters were wronged by my family, by a system of injustice. I stand with them now. I ask for your forgiveness, but more than that, I ask for your understanding." The courtroom was silent. Richard's confession hit like a bombshell. It was an act of courage few had expected from a man who had built his empire on cold, calculated business decisions. The ripple effect of his words spread quickly, as members of the media, the community, and even his own investors exchanged shocked glances. Some would condemn him for his actions. Others would admire him for his newfound sense of morality. But in that moment, Richard knew that he had done the right thing. His redemption wasn't about public approval. It was about restoring something broken. The judge, having listened intently to both sides, nodded solemnly. After a brief deliberation, the gavel struck. "In light of the new evidence and the testimony provided, I hereby rule in favor of the Carters. They shall retain full ownership of their property." A wave of emotion flooded through Sarah. The fight was over, and they had won. Her family, whose legacy had been on the brink of destruction, now had their future secured. The community erupted into applause, their collective effort having finally paid off. Sarah stood up, tears streaming down her face as she embraced her family, the weight of years of struggle lifting off her shoulders. It wasn't just a victory for the Carters. It was a victory for everyone who had stood by them, for every neighbor who had fought to protect what was rightfully theirs. Richard sat quietly, his heart heavy yet full. He had expected relief, but what he felt was more complicated. The victory was bittersweet. He had helped the Carters reclaim what was rightfully theirs, but in doing so, he had lost a part of himself, the part that had been driven by greed and power. What he had gained was something far more valuable, a sense of integrity, a newfound respect for the community, and the understanding that true success was not measured by wealth or status, but by the impact one had on others. Outside the courthouse, the community had gathered to celebrate. The rally that had once been a protest had transformed into a joyful celebration of triumph. Marcus stood beside Sarah, his eyes filled with pride and disbelief. He had watched as his family's history was erased, and now, for the first time, he saw it being restored. He had been part of something bigger than himself, a movement that would be remembered for years to come. The pain and struggle had led to this moment of victory, and the feeling of unity and justice was overwhelming. Sarah looked at Richard, who had joined them in the crowd, and though there were no words between them, there was understanding. Richard had come full circle. He had faced his demons, made his choice, and done what was right. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about reconciliation, about mending the past, and moving forward together. The finality of the moment hit them all at once. The Carters were home, and they would stay there. But for Richard, the journey had just begun. He had crossed the threshold, and there was no going back to the man he had been before. His path was now uncertain, but for the first time in his life, it felt like the right one. The applause and cheers filled the air. But Richard knew that his true redemption would come not from the outside world's approval, but from the quiet peace he found within himself. In the weeks following the trial, Richard took time to reflect on everything that had led up to this moment. Sitting in the quiet of his office, his gaze fell on the papers before him, the ones that had once represented his entire empire. He had spent years building his wealth, always focused on profit, success, and expansion. But now, as he looked back at the choices he had made, it became clear to him that none of it mattered as much as the human connections he had overlooked along the way. Empathy, he realized, was the key to everything. In the rush to succeed, he had forgotten what it meant to see the world through someone else's eyes. The Carters had been fighting for their home, their legacy, and their place in the world, not just against a corporation, but against a system that had failed them for generations. And in his moment of reckoning, Richard had chosen to stand with them. It was a decision that had cost him everything he thought was important, but in return, he had gained something more valuable, a sense of purpose. He had learned that true success wasn't measured by financial gain or prestige. It was measured by the positive impact one could make in the lives of others. Meanwhile, Sarah, now emboldened by their victory, stood before a crowd gathered at a local community event. Her voice, calm but filled with conviction, carried through the microphone. "This fight wasn't just about us," she said, her eyes scanning the sea of faces in front of her. "It was about standing up for what's right, for what's just. It was about knowing that no matter how powerful the opposition, no matter how many times you're told to give up, your voice matters. Our community matters." The crowd erupted into applause, and Sarah smiled, feeling the weight of everything she had fought for. The journey had been long and arduous, filled with moments of doubt and despair. But it had also been filled with hope. Hope that, together, people could change the course of history. Sarah had learned that resilience wasn't just about surviving, but about pushing forward, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Ellen, too, had found her own way to contribute to the fight for justice. Once a loyal assistant to Richard, she had now become a voice for systemic change. Using her platform as a journalist, she began to expose the darker side of the real estate industry. Stories of families displaced by gentrification, of shady dealings that benefited the wealthy at the expense of the vulnerable. Her articles quickly gained traction, and soon her work sparked conversations about the ethics of real estate development and the need for greater accountability. Ellen's courage to speak out, even at the risk of losing her career, inspired many others in the industry to do the same. Her reporting sparked a broader movement, one that pushed for policy reforms aimed at protecting vulnerable communities from the ravages of unchecked development. Ellen realized that while it was one thing to expose injustice, it was another to be part of the solution. She dedicated herself to continuing the fight for equitable development, ensuring that future generations would not have to endure the same struggles the Carters had faced. As for Marcus, the victory had changed him in ways he could never have predicted. The young activist, once a voice among many, had now become a symbol of hope for his community. He had seen firsthand how the power of collective action could bring about change, and he was determined to continue the work that had begun with the Carters. In a powerful moment at the rally, Marcus took to the stage, his voice steady and resolute. "This isn't over," he said, his words echoing through the crowd. "This victory is just the beginning. We've shown that when we stand together, we can make a difference. But the fight isn't just for us. It's for every family, every community that's been pushed aside. We will continue to advocate for our people, for justice, and for a future where everyone has a home." The crowd cheered, and Marcus felt a sense of responsibility settle on his shoulders. The road ahead would be long, but he was ready. He had seen what was possible when people united for a common cause. He knew that the power of community, of standing up for what was right, could change the world. Richard, Sarah, Ellen, and Marcus had all learned profound lessons along their journeys. They had learned that the fight for justice was not a one-time battle. It was a continuous struggle that required empathy, courage, and the willingness to stand up against the forces of greed and inequality. Together, they had proven that one voice could spark a movement, that one decision could change the course of history. And in doing so, they had set a powerful example for future generations to follow. The Carters' victory wasn't just about reclaiming a house. It was about reclaiming dignity, justice, and the power of community. And in the end, it was a reminder to everyone that no matter how impossible the fight may seem, standing together for what's right can lead to transformative change. Months after the trial, Richard made a decision that shocked many. He stepped down from his position as CEO of his company, announcing publicly that he would no longer focus on expanding his wealth or business empire. The news was met with mixed reactions. Some hailed him as a hero for his transformation, while others viewed it as a dramatic fall from grace. But Richard didn't mind the judgment. He knew that the life he had lived, chasing profit at any cost, was no longer the life he wanted. Instead, Richard dedicated himself to philanthropy and advocacy, using his resources and influence to support causes he had once ignored. He launched initiatives aimed at revitalizing underserved neighborhoods, funding education programs, and providing legal assistance to those facing injustice. Richard's new focus wasn't on what he could gain, but on what he could give. He wanted to make amends for the harm he had caused, to make the world a better place, one community at a time. The neighborhood, once on the brink of gentrification and displacement, began to thrive. With Richard's investment in community-driven projects, local businesses flourished, affordable housing initiatives were put in place, and public spaces were revitalized. The changes were slow at first, but they were real. The people who had fought so hard to protect their homes now had the opportunity to build a future for themselves and their children. Sarah, who had once feared the worst, found herself witnessing the transformation of the place she had always called home. Sarah and Richard, who had once been enemies, found common ground in their shared goal of preventing future injustices. They formed an unlikely partnership, working together to advocate for policies that would ensure fair housing, protect marginalized communities, and hold developers accountable for their actions. Their collaboration was a testament to the power of redemption, proving that even the most entrenched divisions could be healed with time, understanding, and a commitment to doing what was right. Sarah often spoke at community events alongside Richard, and their message resonated with those who had once doubted the possibility of change. Together, they spoke of the importance of empathy, the need for systemic reform, and the strength of collective action. The partnership became a symbol of how people from different walks of life could come together for the greater good, transcending their past conflicts to build a better future. Meanwhile, Ellen's role in the movement had not gone unnoticed. As her investigation into the real estate industry and its impact on vulnerable communities gained traction, she decided to write a book about the Carters' fight for justice. The story, both personal and political, had the potential to reach a wide audience and ignite change on a national scale. When Ellen's book was published, it became an instant bestseller. Her honest, compelling writing captivated readers, shedding light on the systemic issues that plagued real estate and the people who had suffered because of them. The book not only amplified the Carters' story, but it also sparked important conversations about fairness, equality, and the true cost of development. Ellen's work was praised for its integrity and impact, and she was invited to speak at conferences, engage with policymakers, and lead discussions on how to create a more just and equitable society. Through her writing, Ellen was able to bring attention to the many others who had faced similar struggles, ensuring that their stories, too, would not be forgotten. Her success was a reflection of the power of truth and the importance of using one's voice to bring about change. As the years passed, the Carters' victory became a symbol of hope for communities across the country. The lessons learned from their fight about resilience, justice, and the power of standing together echoed in the hearts of many who faced similar challenges. The neighborhood, once on the verge of losing everything, had been reborn, and with it, the spirit of activism and unity had spread far beyond its borders. Richard, Sarah, Ellen, and Marcus had each played their part in a story that transcended the boundaries of one neighborhood, one family, and one fight for a home. Their journey had shown the world that redemption was possible, that justice could be achieved, and that the power of community was unstoppable. And as they continued their work, Richard in his philanthropic endeavors, Sarah in her advocacy, Ellen through her writing, and Marcus in his activism, they knew that their story would inspire future generations to continue the fight for what was right. The Carters had reclaimed more than just a house. They had reclaimed their dignity, their legacy, and their place in history. And in doing so, they had left an indelible mark on the world, a mark that would endure long after the final chapter of their story was written. The Carters hosted a block party that became a momentous occasion, a true celebration of resilience, unity, and the strength of the human spirit. The streets were filled with laughter, music, and the vibrant energy of neighbors and friends coming together. Long-standing tensions had faded into the background, replaced by a deep sense of connection. The community, once at risk of being torn apart, now stood stronger than ever, united in their shared victory and the belief that together they could overcome any challenge. Richard, now a changed man, stood at the center of it all, taking in the sights and sounds of a neighborhood he had once tried to erase. He reflected on how one decision, the decision to stand by the Carters and speak out against the injustice he had once perpetuated, had reshaped not just his life, but the lives of so many others. The weight of the past still lingered, but it was now balanced by the hope of the future, by the knowledge that redemption was possible, no matter how far one had fallen. As the evening wore on, Sarah approached Richard with a small, carefully wrapped package. She handed it to him with a quiet smile, and as he unwrapped it, he was met with a restored photograph of their ancestors together, an image of a time when their families had shared not just a history, but a sense of community. The photo, aged yet preserved with care, symbolized not only the healing of old wounds, but also the possibility of reconciliation. In that moment, Richard understood more than ever the depth of his connection to the people he had once seen as obstacles. Tears welled in his eyes as he looked at Sarah, who had fought so fiercely for what was right. She had given him a gift far greater than any material possession. She had shown him the true meaning of humanity. The photo, now restored, was more than just a symbol of the past. It was a symbol of redemption, of forgiveness, and of the power to heal even the deepest divides. As the camera slowly panned out from the joyful scene, capturing the heart of the community, a thriving neighborhood full of life, hope, and possibility, the message was clear. Justice, compassion, and the willingness to change could transform not only individuals, but entire communities. This was a testament to the power of standing up for what is right, even when it means facing uncomfortable truths. And with that powerful image of unity and redemption, the screen fades to black, and the voiceover gently reminds the viewers, remember, no matter how lost you may feel, change is always within reach. Share this story, like, and subscribe to our channel to keep spreading the message of hope and justice. Together, we can make a difference.